This week we're studying Parashat Shofetim from Leib Heyman, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. And I have a short piece to share, two short pieces to share from Rav Leib. This week I learned with his son-in-law, and it was a very, very intricate piece going on and on and on and delving into a concept which I think maybe, I don't want to say it's above our group or us, but I think it was very, very nitpicking and digging on a very deep level on a certain topic having to do with Moshe Rabbeinu and David HaMelech. So I extracted two pieces of this that can be enjoyed by us and hopefully even practical at our level. And may HaKadosh Baruch Hu grant me the wisdom in presenting it in a way that you will enjoy and hopefully be inspired from and grow. So, on that note, we know that in this week's Torah portion, we're speaking about the judges of Israel that are going to be appointed, and every generation, not only the first generation, but every generation to be appointed to judge the Jewish people and in order to guide them and enforce the laws of the Torah, making sure that we keep our heritage, our tradition, our way of life to be different than the Gentiles, not in a better or worse way, yet that is what we accepted upon us as the nation of Israel, as the chosen nation at Mount Sinai. So Reb Leib asks a honest question. He says, is there any reason for the juxtaposition between last week's Torah portion, Parashat Re'eh, and this week's Torah portion, Parashat Shofetim? Why does this week's portion follow immediately last week's Torah portion? Okay, we've seen this question come up by many of our commentaries throughout the Torah. Sometimes it's brought up, sometimes it isn't. So he asks, is there a reason? And he says there is. And he gives a reason based on Rashi asking this very same question, but in the book of Exodus. Back in the beginning of Parashat Mishpatim, which does deal with the laws, Mishpat, right? Mishpatim are the laws and Shofetim are those who enforce the laws. So back in Parashat Mishpatim, Rashi asks, why is it that these laws follow Parashat Yitro? Well, at the end of Parashat Yitro, the Torah speaks about the commandment to construct the altar, the Mizbeach, and the laws about how it can and cannot be constructed. And Rashi answers, well, the Torah is coming to teach us something. The juxtaposition of the building of the altar followed immediately by the laws of that have to be observed by the Jewish people. Rashi tells us, comes and teaches us that the Sanhedrin, again, the judges, the great assembly, is supposed to be positioned next to the altar, literally in the temple. And therefore, a room in the temple, which is not too far from the altar, was the room where the Sanhedrin, the great Sanhedrin of 71 members, sat. So comes Reb Leib and says, Rashi's very question and answer can be applied to this week's Torah portion also. Last week's Torah portion, which we learned together with Reb Leib was going on and on about last week how over and over again, even this past Shabbat, when we were reading the Parashat, I kept on, how many times is the word hamakom, the place being brought up? I mean, a couple dozen times. 3-4 dozen times easily. The whole Torah portion is speaking about the temple, the place. We're talking about the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, the place that Hashem will choose, which fits perfectly. What happens right after that? The laws of the judges, the laws of appointing the judges and a king. So like before, back in Exodus, it was the altar, which is in the temple, followed by the laws. Here again, it's the temple, followed by those enforcing the law. So he said it fits perfectly. And he continues and says that the order in which the Jewish people were commanded to do these simple, very important laws also followed perfectly. Meaning, I'll explain. The Talmud in Masechet Sanhedrin says in page 20b that the Jewish people were commanded three things when they entered the land of Israel. Number one, to appoint a king. Number two, to destroy Amalek, to destroy them completely. And number three, to build a temple. Reb Leib says it fits perfectly. The first thing, meaning fits time-wise, the sequence makes sense. The first thing to do is appoint a king to help us lead the Jewish people into the land of Israel, conquer the land, and destroy Amalek. Only after Amalek is destroyed can the temple be built in all of its glory. And that's where Shaul failed, and a lot of different hard things happened over there. But the general concept is exactly that. First the king, then destroy Amalek, and then the temple can be built. Now, taking us back a little earlier to this week's Torah portion, Reb Leib shows us a unique mitzvah in our Torah. Take a look. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 14. Ki tavo el haaretz, and when you will come to the land, asher Adonai Elohecha noten lach, that the Lord your God is giving you, virishta v'yashavta ba, and you possess it and live therein, ve'amarta, and you shall say, asima alai melech kechol hagoyim asher sevivotai, I will set a king over myself like all the nations around me. Now, the obvious question is, before I give the obvious question, Reb Leib brings a Ramban, the Nachmanides. The Nachmanides is saying that the Torah is commanding the Jewish people to approach the Kohanim, to approach the Leviim and the judges and the Shofetim, and ask them to appoint a king. Right? Asima alai melech. Place a king over us. Now, Reb Leib's question is, one second, this mitzvah is a true wonder. In the entire Torah, there is no other mitzvah that's dependent on the Jewish people demanding it or asking for it. It's not like the Jewish people are to enter the land of Israel and ask for a temple and ask to plant a vineyard so that they could take the first fruit of it. No, it's done. If you have land and it bears fruit, you take off your tithes and your bikurim and everything else that has to be done. Here it seems to be Reb Leib saying that the Jewish people are commanded to come, that they are to ask, they're to demand a king before the king is brought to them. What does that mean? Do we appoint the king, or do we wait for the Jewish people to ask to appoint the king? So listen to an amazing answer. And in my humble opinion, I'm going to make this answer so practical to each and every one of us. Let me just share with you what Reb Leib says. Reb Leib says that the essence of a king requires the approval of his nation. That is, Reb Leib says, the great difference between a king and a ruler. You see, a ruler rules against the will of his constituents, against the will of his citizens. He does what's good for him, and that's all he cares about. However, a king rules with the consent of his citizens. As the Talmud says, En elech belo am, there's no king without a nation. You can't go out to the desert and say, I'm the king. You're the king of who? Of what? Nothing. A king is only a king who has a nation that follows. And therefore, says Reb Leib, powerfully, that the nation of Bnei Israel had to come and request a king, because that is the only way a king can be. There's no room in our religion, there's no room in Torah for a ruler, in Hebrew as it's called a moshel, a dictator. No, there's only room for a melech, a leader. We have to understand that king means leader. Dictator is a ruler. That's the difference between a melech and a moshel. Completely different. So Reb Leib was short on that part, on that piece he was part. I wanted to suggest a very practical insight for us all. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we have any kings among us. Is anyone a king that's online right now? No. But the answer is yes. We are all kings and queens in our own way. And we are to be. We have to aspire to that as well. As leaders, teachers, parents, most importantly, parents, grandparents, we have to act with our children as kings and queens and not as tyrant rulers. That's not the way of Torah. If the king of the nation, the leader of our nation, is not to be that way, how are we? How could we then? We have to understand that a position of leadership, as small or as big as it may be, means carrying those that are following you, inspiring them, putting their needs before yours. When we make a decision, we're making a decision based for the greater good, based on the masses, on the majority. That's a king. A king who only cares about the nobles and about his amount of gold and horses that he has. That's not a king. That's a ruler. That's a tyrant. The problem is all of the movies we watched when we were growing up shows us kings, right? Hollywood shows us kings that are mean and slicing people's heads off and are dictators and barking at other people. So to us, that's what a king is. Go and read a little bit about David HaMelech, Shlomo HaMelech, the righteous kings. Go see what the Talmud has to say about David HaMelech. So different than what Hollywood shows us as a king. Night and day. You cannot compare. We have to understand that the way the Torah views a king is viewing a person who is selfless, a person who is putting others before them, a person who realizes the power of responsibility that is given to them to lead others. And this is true in our lives as well. Whether we are just parents, which is the greatest job or position we can ever have, or if it's as a teacher, a leader, an elected official, as small or as great as power or importance it may be, all of those decisions that are made by any of those positions should always be by putting the others first, putting the people first, putting the constituents first. You want to know the truth? The citizens, the constituents will feel it, and they will know. They will know the truth, and they will know if the decisions and the choices that you are making have their best interest in mind or not. As a parent, it is sometimes so easy to just get annoyed or bogged down and want to do what's good for you or good for you and your wife. But when you forego something that you really want to do by putting your children first, they feel it. And that feeling of commitment that you are doing at that moment is a feeling that instills in your child an enormous amount of security. And that security is what helps them develop to be a healthy child, a healthy adolescent, and eventually a healthy adult. The opposite is detrimental. When a parent or parents are always choosing themselves over their kids, you know what that means? You know what that means to the child? You're sending them clear signals that they're secondary, that they're unimportant, that they're annoying, that they're a burden. What does that translate and create? Insecurity and more insecurity. And unfortunately, that leads them to having issues growing up, issues in their adulthood, issues when they will be parents themselves. Children can never feel disregarded. Now, on the flip side, parents do need alone time and do need time to breathe. That's what school's for. You know, school is half an educational experience, but the other half, I guess, is a babysitting service as well. Now, was it always like this? No, it wasn't always like this. Are we thankful it's like this? I guess this is what it is. We as parents do need alone time. However, your children cannot feel that you're just always trying to run away from them or escape them. You can do it physically, you could do it intentionally or unintentionally. You could just be throwing devices and technology at your children to keep them busy and away from you, but they feel it. You'll go and ask your child, what do you prefer to do? Play a video game or play basketball with you? Or watch a movie or go biking with you? They'll choose the first. Their temptation of watching something or playing something or using electricity or electronics or technology is too strong for them to openly admit to what's deep inside. So they'll go for that. It's like a candy bar or an apple. What are you going for? Most people go for the candy bar if it's right in front of you. It takes a really disciplined person to say no to the candy bar and yes to the apple. Well, now it's already become in fashion to no to the candy bar, yes to the apple, but whatever. A child deep down craves the basketball with their father, craves taking a bike ride, craves the alone time with their parents, the quality time. They may not be able to articulate it, but their soul, their mind, their heart, their emotions really need it. So stop throwing things at your children to get them out of your way, or stop running away and escaping your children, because they feel it and they know it. Rather, consider the tremendous gift you have, that Baruch Hashem, you have children, that they're healthy, that they're capable, and invest quality time, educational time, fun time, good memories with them that they will take with them for the rest of their lives. So remember, act like a king, but like a king the way Hashem, the Torah, quantifies a king and not a ruler. We can all be kings and queens in our lives, kings and queens in our own homes, but make sure you act like one and not a tyrant barking ruler. May Kadosh Baruch Hu bless us in the merit of Reb Heyman, who gave us this amazing insight. I don't know if we would have ever, I don't know if I would have ever thought of, I mean, yes, of course, when I learned the Gemaras about David HaMelech, I think, amazing. But this pinpoint difference between a Melech and a Moshel and a king, and the king has to be asked, not really elected. Kings are not really elected by the people. It was not a democracy. But the very first time that the king or the king's chain that was going to be passed down for the Jewish people, the dynasty of kings, it had to be asked, demanded by the Jewish people to teach us that a king is there to serve and not to be served. That's deep. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.